Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Dynamic Decisions podcast, where we explore the strategies that drive successful decision making in the world of business. Why? Because great decisions come from great conversations. I am your host, Tisha Cable, CEO of CModel Data, and today we have an incredible guest with us who's dedicated to helping high growth startups scale effectively. Lindsey, welcome to the show. Lindsey is a strategic advisor with expertise in operations, monetization, and execution risk mitigation. Lindsey brings so much knowledge. We're so excited to have her here sitting at the table with us to have a chat today. Lindsey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We'd love to hear more about AeroSpike and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been at AeroSpike for about 6 months. I'm the head of business operations. Previously, my focus was product operations when I was hired, but kind of to a T of what both you focus on and what your product does. I was kind of brought into the broader business operations just because the decisions that we needed to be making at the time needed to just be elevated. So, in terms of what that means for my particular role, I support our executive team. When I say that, I really just mean the entire company and all of their functions. I'm bringing in things like operational cadences, just like you said in the beginning, these conversations that actually drive some of these decisions. And then my next focus is okay, once we have this business practice beginning to be adopted, how do we evolve our systems in order to alleviate what I think a lot of operational people understand as the operational overhead and burden that it requires to do things like this, but that it's still required for our business. So that is my focus at AeroSpike.
Can we talk a little bit more about operational burden? I love that term. Dig in a little bit.
Yeah, so I started my operations career in product operations specifically. And if I could generalize product and engineering teams, they're highly sensitive to things that provide no value. And it's hard to see sometimes the forest through the trees in terms of why am I having to report on this information all the time, especially for strong agile groups. I'm just trying to do my job, right? This thought. Operational burden to me is when we are asked to do things again that we think provide no value. One, either because we don't have the context, or two, because it is so much work for the value you're actually getting. And that's where I think my exposure in product and engineering has really honed in my business operations skills. I've had experience at larger companies where we've had a new spreadsheet every quarter, a different tool every 6 months. And while I think everyone's trying to work towards the best thing, I remember asking one of my bosses at the time, do we serve the leadership or do we serve the company? And I think splitting that, it helps people understand that this isn't just for leaders. This is for the company to move in the direction that we all want it to. And I will say at growth stage, that's much easier because everybody wants to get paid. So we have a little bit of that argument just embedded, which makes my job easier, but I still want to reduce the amount of hours people are spending just to bring transparency to move the company forward.
Let's stay on the topic of transparency in the company and really bring back your idea of context. So, what's your experience with delivering a sufficient amount of context around decisions that are being made, and really ensuring that you want to make sure that there's some levels of transparency, right, in every organization. But what's too much and what's too little in your view? What are some of the areas where you've experienced, building up enough context and not building up enough context for folks to really get at what they're doing?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. This is a balance that I try to figure out on the day to day. I still don't know that I've figured it out perfectly. I think for the last year or so, I have gone on the side of too much context because in my role, I'm combating a adoption challenge, right? With new process, context to me allows people to, just like I just explained, to understand the why so that they feel better doing it. But for the first time in my career, I'm actually dealing with some things of like, just tell me what you want me to do, which is like not something I'm used to at all and doesn't quite make sense. So I'm trying to figure out that balance myself. But I always go for the who, what, when, where, why times five. And then it's just repeating that same thing over and over again. In my work, for example, rolling out a strategic framework, like how we set goals and how we talk about work through operational cadences. I spent an hour with our extended leadership team just reviewing conceptually what those things are and what they attempt to do for a business, and also why they're important for the individuals on the team and the power and autonomy that it brings people. Rather than, I feel like, without context in my world, again, it just becomes like, oh, you're just asking this of me and I don't understand why. What does it do for me? So that what does it do for me context is probably that happy balance between the too much context and too little, just answering that question in a way that your audience is going to understand. Hopefully should allow that adoption to be smoother.
So what's hard about this process? So I like the idea of calling it, what does it do for me? What's the most difficult and complex part about the process that you describe? Is it the people? Is this like a people problem and how they relate? Or is this a complexity in communication? Like, what is it that gets in the way?
Yeah, I think it is a people thing. I think if you're coming in and you're bringing in operations to an entire company, you have a large variety. One, of how people learn, two, how people work. So your kind of acceptance and resistance has so much variance that it's difficult to predict. So I also function in this high feedback world, not to say that all feedback is valuable. And that's something that I like to tell the people that I work with often too, is like, I'm looking at this holistically. So while you specifically have this opinion, I've got a few more. And I feel like this is where my experience in product directly is helpful. Those people are my customer, but the business is also my customer. And I have to balance between those two things. So while I think there is complexity of communication in terms of like perception of what you're saying, I really think it's just the variety in which how we work. Any system with a human in it is complex, flat out,
That's right.
which means that you have to constantly be evolving, which is why I'm so passionate about operations, because I feel that without it, the natural evolution might not go in the direction that you want it to as a business. And then you just ask the question at the end of the day of why did we fail? Well, you probably could ask that question a little sooner.
Considering your experience working with high growth startups, do you have frameworks for making high stakes decisions when you don't have enough information?
Yes.
Okay.
This is an interesting one because usually when I come into a company, and I have also advised in this way as well, you sort of have a bare minimum view that you need to get to in order to have that spidey sense, which is only helpful when you don't have the transparency, right? Then your job becomes building the transparency and validating or invalidating that sense. But your question is around what are the frameworks to kind of get to that bare minimum? So, a framework, I don't know if I would call it a framework, but this like thought process that I've had is if I can document the existing operating model meaning the org structure, the way that work is talked about, things like strategic frameworks. Are we doing goal setting? Are we not? Are there regular discussions? What happens in those discussions? Kind of the benefits of that approach, the negatives of that approach. And then I use that and I consider the company's size, scale, growth objectives, as well as like their general market and customers and point in time that they're at on a maturity scale. And then I work with that team to identify a target operating model. So in that documentation of the current operating model, I have, of course, added my spidey sense and my assumptions just from my experience. But then we talk about what is ideal state, and then we kind of create the burn down list from there. In my experience, usually that burn down list starts with something like the strategic framework. How are we translating our strategy into execution so that we know that our teams are actually driving that as our end result? And something that I liked, and congratulations on the Forbes piece, but you talked about the outcome focus. And that's really the first step is to get to it's not just the activity as impact, the outcome as impact. So if that's our first step to say strategy to execution, okay, great. We've understood this specific framework. For our company, then how do we talk about those things, which to me is those cadences? And then how do I build the systems that allow us to see across that entire ladder so that ideally, like we said at the beginning, I can reduce those cadences over time in favor of a self-serve way of working to bring the autonomy back. So it's a little bit of a squeeze at the beginning, and then it's with the idea of I want to let this go, and it should just be a regular culture practice for us.
Okay, first of all, you're my new best friend, and we're best friends, and I want you to come over and talk about all the things that we wanna do at CModel with our prospects so that they completely understand. This is I think that it's almost the idea of do the hard work now so it can be greater later. I used to tell my kids this all the time, and I think the concept is the same. So there is no getting away from building an appropriate strategic framework, right? And there is no way of getting around having to do the work, right? Now, there is a way to use your strategy to make your execution more efficient and better. There is a way to make your execution by documenting, make your strategy more efficient and
Totally.
better, right? By being outcome focused. So, thank you for one, validating that because it's a concept that's not always widely perceived to be I would say accurate. Most people, especially in a startup environment, they're going to say go go go, right? When I want to say hold on just a moment, think a little bit and then go. Now, you don't have to overdo it, right? What are your thoughts there on sort
Yeah,
of the difference between a mature company? You did apply in your framework maturity, which I love because it does matter, right?
it
How
does.
much of this work you can do does depend on the company's maturity. So talk a little bit more about that.
And I've personally made the mistake of adding too much. So I saw the effect of that and the resistance of that, and then the consequence against the actual execution. You bring up a strong point there of, yes, while I was saying kind of tying what is our strategic framework, it is in the service of aligning the execution in a practice in which it can go the other direction. Because I have, like, as a principle or maybe a value, whatever we want to label it as, I do think that bottoms up more minds are better than the few. And my boss might not like the statement that I'm about to make, but I've never made an executive team that is capable of knowing every single thing going on at any period of time, from understanding of the market, understanding of our customers, the product reality, any of that. So it's not that we don't trust them to make the decisions, it's that we should distribute that because distribution is power. Diversity is power. That's what brings
Yes.
things together more holistically. So I definitely favor once we get to that point of this like bottoms up approach. The other comment that I'll make is that I'm a little bit allergic now to the phrase specifically slow down to speed up because I don't know that that's true. I think you can actually let off the gas. Don't put the brake on, just let off the gas in this sense of so as to an executive, I would say, stop adding pressure about timeline. Add pressure about why, what's going on, so that you can start to read from your team the realities, not being focused on just continuing to drive them to completion of some that's an output focus.
On what you just said, what's really cool is if you take what you just said, if I'm explaining to my team why, and that then would tell them why they need to go fast, right, in a particular moment. Or so I don't have to drive to like, here's a due date on something you need to do. I can drive to like, the market says that right now is the time to hit. That's a completely different approach than do this right now because I said so. But
Yeah.
let me tell you about this market that we're in and the pace by which this market is moving. That then, if you've got enough experience to understand it, should be enough to tell you why we need to move at a certain pace at this moment. That's just a really, even for me, it's just a really good little nugget. So thank you for that.
I would almost say that the market says to hit now because XYZ. I still think through the lens of the product team because in that instance, then that team is able to say, oh, we've been focusing on delivering this one thing here, but what you just described to me is not the same. that means that I could cut that thing from this release. And that
Yes.
allows me to hit the market sooner. So it's giving them the information to make the decisions. I don't know if it's a generational thing or what. It probably isn't because I feel like everyone in their life has heard it. Because I said so, I am also allergic to that. My mom is gonna listen to this and laugh. I never listened to it. I had a big book of Tell Me Why. I think the majority of people sit in that camp. So what you also do with by not providing context is you're creating natural resistance. Not the good kind, not tension in this trying to understand what's going on. It's like a rebellion. I don't want to give you that. Everybody goes to that state. We go to our defaults when we're pressured. I mean, like nobody likes that.
Yeah, I come from a workplace of a different generation. However, I there's nothing wrong with this part of the change and the shift, which is tell me why. I believe that in my growing up in the workplace, I didn't always have the opportunity to ask why. But I wholly appreciate that it's required of me as a leader to say why, because then I tend to get a much better result from those who I want to work with. And I believe, we don't turn back the hands of time, but I suspect that if I had known why too, sometimes way back in the day, long time ago, then I too could have responded a little bit differently and even had other alternatives to offer as to how we might accomplish something within the constraints that we might have. So I appreciate that. Let's jump forward and really go a little deeper into the outcomes place. So when it comes to tracking outcomes of your major decisions, what metrics do you find to be the most revealing? And you can pick an area if you want, an area of operations. Maybe it's your favorite metric, but that's the question at hand.
Yeah, there's some fun ones. So I'll start with the qualitative, which is usually what it's additional assessment on top of my operating model investigation. I'll run a survey, but in an ENPS style, so that I can have it as quantitatively qualitative as possible. But the questions in there are things like I have an understanding of our strategy. I understand how my role drives our strategy. If there are teams that work tightly together, which everybody should, it would be a question like, our product and engineering team share the same philosophy in execution. Our sales and product team have strong communication, so on and so forth, right? So I'm getting this qualitative review, but then there's some more fun process oriented ones that I think are telling at least about cultural acceptance and like seeing, okay, yes, we've started to apply some of this target operating model.
Mhm.
What is our end result? And it will be slightly lagging, obviously, because the adoption process always takes longer than expected. Sales efficiency should be one of them. And another one that obviously with my product experience that I care about is our product development life cycle. So our time to market as well as the success of those launches to market. So, not saying just the time, because we just spent a good amount of chat about what time doesn't actually mean anything, but also how was our beta engagement? So, following that with usage metrics and things like that. I'm trying to think if there's any other ones that I'm missing.
While you think about that, I want to tell the audience we've got a new word. This is a new word alert or a new concept. It's called quantitatively qualitative. I love it.
Man, I just make stuff up sometimes.
From my new best friend, we've got great new words coming too. This is awesome. Let's keep going. Or did you think of anything else? And before
Yeah,
we
I'll make one comment that I think is sales efficiency related, but I haven't quite nailed down just because of my lack of experience. But something I'm curious about lately is the funnel
Mhm.
and its connection to actual usage. So when I say that, I mean things like our ICP
Yeah.
we can use to improve our funnel and our sales efficiency and all of this. But post launch, what do we see actually in our usage against that ICP or TAM or whatever kind of label you want to have? I became a little bit obsessed with connecting the product development lifecycle measures in terms of, okay, this discovery with this profile type towards the end of launch. But I think you could blow that up to kind of have the full from a first touch point to the end, what are kind of the volumes that we see and variety that we see. I don't know if it's actually meaningful, but that's something that my brain has been tickled with lately. I think it could be very telling about where our focus could be improved.
So just tagging on to like, where could our focus be improved? So we've got this traditional sense of an ICP. And I actually think that if we adjusted it to a personality base,
Mm.
that we'd likely find a new set of metrics, a new set of ways to measure. Because I often get tripped up on this ICP scenario because I don't always think of our ICP in the traditional ways. It's a company that looks like this and this person in the company and they do this for their job. I think it's more so they think a certain way. They feel a certain way about the things that they think. They want to operate a certain way. They're looking for a certain thing. They're motivated by something like this. And you can actually build a profile of an individual within an organization that looks like that. And then just imagine the different metrics, the different things that you might be able to track. What does a funnel look like when you go back and look at an ICP in that way?
And
Anyway.
that's part of the itch, yeah, because my
Yeah.
exposure was mostly been on the persona side, right? Like when you're building a product, you are kind of articulating that from the design thinking perspective, but that remains a gap, at least in my experience, between what on the sales cycle or marketing cycle, funnel cycle that we've determined is our buyer and our user might not actually sync with that. And that might be okay because it might just be a feedback loop that occurs and allows us to evolve faster. But I don't see the prioritization of that conversation so much happening. And I just think that that's interesting because it doesn't close the loop.
On that note, what are some decisions that one might make to start getting at this? Like, what are some things that you need to start thinking about? And you be decision forward. It might not be the decision itself, but the stuff I need to maybe break down, which is decision forward along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, I think a conversation anecdotally, right? You can start and explore between those various groups. That's always usually where I start because like the systems person in me says, "Oh, well go and tag every single touch point to this type of persona and then have a report in which you can look at a dashboard and see if it fits what you thought it was, if it didn't, right? And you can build all this thing." But that requires a significant investment. So like the first is just exploring that problem statement specifically, getting
Mhm.
that group together. What do you see? What do you see? Okay, how could we go about seeing this on a more consistent basis?
So to the audience, what we just heard was if I've got a new thing, so you've got all the traditional metrics and all the normal stuff. In this case, there's kind of like this new thing that we want to explore. Well, there's a set of activities that you can take in order to explore the new thing, and it doesn't have to be a full blown go out and modify your data, set new metrics, but you can start with conversations. What do you think? What do you think? I like that because a lot of times we don't know how to get started in exploring the picture when it looks a little bit outside of the current picture, when we want to go outside of the norm. So that's like a new idea is brought to the table. What do we do about it? Okay, I have a little exercise. Oh, did you want to add to that
Yeah,
before?
just a quick
Yeah.
one. I think something like I want to avoid using the word AI, but I'm going to in this instance because I do think I'm really interested in seeing CModel because
Yeah.
I have advised on a tool before that was specifically over the product development life cycle that allowed teams to work however they want, but it brought up themes using machine learning and AI. That would be a way in which we don't I loved that because in my past I had to go rebuild Jira and have all of these custom fields. It took me 6 months to do it. And then after launching it, people wouldn't use the fields because the adoption of that is very arduous and nobody wants to do it. Okay, automate it. Say, ask a question about these are the things that I want to understand.
Mhm.
It's way easier now. We live in the future. It's amazing.
We live in the future. We can't wait. And thank you for acknowledging C model and what we're doing because the idea is we want to help you to answer that question. What do we do to achieve our goals and know why in much simpler ways than how that would happen in the past? So thank you for acknowledging that. Let's go to identifying your decision making persona. So I'm going to read out 4 questions. And for each question, you're going to tell me what percentage of you resonates between 0 and 100%. Now, you only get 100%.
Okay.
total, right?
Okay.
Okay.
4
And
questions?
4 questions. And the way that I read the questions is essentially as if you're considering a new growth strategy. And these would be questions you would be asking. So you're identifying, would you ask a question like this, essentially? Okay, here's the first one. You ready?
Yeah.
We're considering a new growth strategy. How are we going to ensure that it aligns with our personal values and the core values of the company? So that's question one. What percentage of you ask questions like that? Like that's that your style?
Before I give the percentage, it is my style,
Okay.
but in my experience, the values aren't necessarily lived.
Oh,
So the value of said values isn't necessarily there. I've only been at one place that did that really well, and it was when I got to Twilio, and
yeah.
I did use in that instance the values a lot, and so did everyone in the company. But that's the only time that I've experienced that strength. So in a situation in which it is strong, if
Yeah.
I is that I would
Yeah, that's
say
good. Yeah.
I wanna probably put more than 25% because I feel like just leading with 25% is a bit of a cheat, so I'll say 30.
Okay, we'll give that one 30%. So that's called a feeler. Okay, so that's the feeler persona. There's lots of gut in there. A lot of times, expertise and experience over time leads to a lot of gut and a lot of like intuitive decision making. 30% feeler so far. Okay, let's keep going. And just for the audience, this idea of values, of the said values, like when the values aren't real in a company, it does matter to people. So we like to make sure that the values are actually in a huge part of how you make decisions, making it applicable across your hiring decisions, your firing decisions, anything, because you want to know what you stand for. It's your yeses and nos. Okay, let's keep going. Here's the next one. So, reflecting on last year's growth initiatives, what specific trends or insights have we uncovered that significantly influence our next strategic moves?
Ooh, 40%.
Sense. Okay. So that is called a planner. Okay.
Not
So
surprised.
that's the planner. So you have so that
30%
you got 30% left so far, but
Ooh,
you can always move things around. Okay.
okay, cool. Because I might
Yes, you can always move them around. Here's your next one. In evaluating our last scaling efforts, what key lessons have we learned that fundamentally change our decision making process?
so kind of a retro style. Let's just say 10 because I feel like the next one is gonna be good.
Okay. Okay. We give you 10%. That's called a counter. So that's a counter. So retro style is kind of good. I just go back and I count what happened last time. Okay. Here's the last one. We're formulating this new growth strategy. What specific data points are we going to rely on to validate our decisions?
I knew it. I'll put my last 20, but I do need to redistribute.
Okay, that one is called the data driver. Yeah, really, typically us operations folks, we live heavily in that data driver space too. Okay, how do you want to redistribute? Right now, you've got 30% feeler, 40% planner, 10% counter, and 20% data driver.
I think I'll do 30, 30, 10, 30.
Okay, I like it. What I love is by yourself, you ended up at a pretty balanced decision making persona. And that's the goal, right? I tell all of our audience the idea is to be balanced. You don't have to be balanced all at one time, though. There's some times where you lean more heavily on one persona and other times where you lean on another. But it's really good to know how you decide because then it's really good to share to increase transparency with your team so that they can also understand how you decide. So we got it. 30% feeler, 30% planner, 10% counter, and 30% data driver. Thank you for participating in that with me. I have one last question before we wrap everything up. So if you look across your current industry and you had to give advice to a business leaders and think about emerging leaders in your space. What's one piece of advice that you would share with emerging leaders in your industry?
Well, I'm gonna cheat and use something that we just talked about. And it's not something that I'm just leveraging from this conversation. I've actually said it in other recordings, which is why I was conflicted about the values answer, because me personally, I have identified my own values. So when searching for a job, searching for a culture at a company, searching for a husband, let's say, where I want to live, right? All of these like questions that do require a little bit more gut, right? Because the data doesn't necessarily exist. I do use my personal values, which are growth, respect, wholeness, honesty, and freedom. Did I say growth?
You did.
Yeah. Those are my personal values. And I know that if I'm challenged in one area, it's because my value is challenged. If I don't have the freedom, if I don't have the ability to grow, I'm not going to feel like I'm giving my best self. So, as an emerging leader, I feel that being your best self at work impacts your relationships and being your best self as well, how you interact with your family, your partner, whatever it is. So, I don't have it perfect. I can't find a job that's going to get all of those, nor could I find a relationship that gets all of those, but I can look at my life holistically and figure out the right balance. If I don't have growth at work, maybe I need a new hobby. And there's ways that you can resolve those problems. So my advice would be to seek out that it's not a higher self, but just knowing yourself rather than having things happen to you. You have the ability to make the decisions about what impacts your day to day and long term life.
That's great. And if you're talking to a leader who's established and long term and has been around for a while and may feel like they have nothing new to learn, what would your advice to them be?
Think about retiring early. No.
Stop it.
I think the advice I think my advice would be the same. I think it would be what is not serving you at the moment. Okay, great. We figured out that it's growth. Does that mean that you need something different at work? You need to reach into a new area, you need to learn something different? I think as a individual, I want to do a hobby every year, whatever time period I think about, that makes me bad at something. Because I find that once you get really good at something, you get bored. So once you start having to figure something else out and get better at it, one humbles you, reminds you where everybody else is at, and two, it just brings more variety to your life. I think physical activities are a great way to do that if you're able. And if not, maybe it's the mental stimulation that you just need in another area.
This is great. Thank you so much. I think that that's a great perspective, Lindsay. We thank you to our listeners. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, you found this episode to be value. We ask you to subscribe it, rate it, share it with your network. Let's keep the conversation going. Hashtag Dynamic Decisions Podcast on your favorite social media. Lindsay, before we leave, tell people where they can find out more about you and find out more about AeroSpike.
Yeah, find us both on LinkedIn. Follow both of us on LinkedIn. We have a little bit of a spiff going on for LinkedIn followers, so do us a favor and help our sales folks. Yeah, LinkedIn's a great place. I believe my email is directly on there. I'm always open for things like this. I'm also a mentor to women that are entering either in my industry or just generally. So I'm happy to speak to whomever. Women is my focus, but anyone is welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Appreciate you. Come back and visit us soon. Thank you again to the audience for listening. Remember again that the best decisions come from great conversations. I have really, really enjoyed this conversation and we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks again.